believer in Yeshua as the Messiah. I actually came out of Rabbinic Judaism some 30 years ago. And at the time, I was kind of like a fish out of water. I really didn't know what to do with myself. And I at first tried going to a church on Sunday, and continued to go to my synagogue on Friday nights and Saturdays. And pretty quickly that was not working. I was like a fish out of water, like I said. The pastor of the church came to me and said, "Why don't you try going to a Messianic synagogue?" I said, "What's a Messianic congregation?" He said, "I said, what's a Messianic congregation?" You gotta realize this was 1984 or so, and maybe 1983. So I'm like, "What's a Messianic Jewish congregation?" And so he told me there's one over in Fort Worth at the time, and so I started going there. And I was still sort of a fish out of water because it was meeting on Friday nights and Sundays, believe it or not, back in those days. And the pastor, rabbi, he called himself, but he was more of a pastor. He actually was a graduate from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. His first thought was to open a church modeled after the first Chinese Baptist church in Fort Worth, called the First Jewish Baptist Church. And it was actually officially a Baptist mission to the Jews. So I quickly discovered at the time that Messianic Judaism, especially at the time, was kind of like a box of grape nuts, you know? There's an awful lot of grapes, an awful lot of nutty grapes in it, and an awful lot of nuts. Okay, so I was actually ostracized because I studied Talmud, and I was at covered dish. They had a covered dish dinner like we have here on Friday evenings, but people would bring like pork and stuff. It was typical. And I wouldn't eat that stuff, and I was considered legalistic because of that. So what I did do is I started doing research. And I went to the Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary Library, which is one of the largest theological libraries in the world. It's like 3 stories high, and it's all theology. They have a big Judaic section. And I wanted to find out the truth. I couldn't believe this gap that I was experiencing. I just couldn't believe that this was the way it was. That it was the way it was meant to be. The only difference, for me was now I believe Yeshua was the Messiah. I hadn't become a Christian. Yeshua didn't come to create a new religion.
That's right.
He came to be the Messiah of the old one. And so I started hitting the books and spending hours and hours of my day at the seminary library trying to get to the bottom of this puzzle. And I'm going to share with you today some of the things that I found and the smoking gun that I found. And it will potentially change your life. First, let me tell you a few things about the words Christian and Christianity that may surprise you, may not. The word Christianity never appears in the New Testament, not once. Okay, the word Christian appears, plural or singular, 3 times, always in the context of something that unbelievers were calling believers. In other words, it was a derogatory term at the time.
Yes.
It was not something they called themselves. Paul, in all of his letters, in fact, I used to marvel at this. I think it was the Open Bible I was looking at, and various of Paul's letters would have a summary subject matter of this or that book. And under several of Paul's letters, the subject matter was Christian living. Well, that's funny. The word Christian never appears in the book. Paul never ever used the word Christian in any of his letters, nor does the word ever part from his lips in the book of Acts. He never called himself a Christian. Do you know what Paul called himself? A Jew. On one occasion, a Pharisee. And yes, he acknowledged that he was a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, which is what we're going to talk about. In Acts 24:5, he's challenged by a group that say, hey, is it true that you're a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes? And he says, I am a follower of that way that you call a sect. Okay, so that's Acts 24:5. So I wanted to find out who were these Nazarenes and what was this all about. And so in one of the so-called church fathers, the early Christian writers, I found a 4th century writer by the name of Epiphanius, one of the major church fathers, gives a very interesting description of these Nazarenes. If you want to follow along with me, what I did here it's Epiphanius Panarion 29 here. What I did was Epiphanius would go off on tangents, talk about other subjects at length, and then come back to his original subject. He also just said a lot of derogatory things about Jews that were just not necessary and basically anti-Semitic. So I eliminated all of that material. So there's some dots in here. And I just pulled what constructive things he said about the Nazarenes. He said, but these sectarians did not call themselves Christians, but Nazarenes. That's an important fact. The Nazarenes did not call themselves Christians. They called themselves Nazarenes. However, he says, they are simply complete Jews. Now, you can take this in one of two ways. Some people take it complete Jews, meaning really Jewish, completing their Jewishness by accepting the Messiah. But Epiphanius was an anti-Semite. What he really meant was, they're complete Jews. That's what he was saying. But anyway, he says they're complete Jews. They use not only the New Testament, but the Old Testament as well as the Jews do. Can you imagine that? They actually used the Old Testament, not just the New Testament. Imagine that. They have no different ideas, but confess everything exactly as the law proclaims it, and in the Jewish fashion, except for their belief in Messiah, if you please. For they acknowledge both the resurrection of the dead and the divine creation of all things, and they declare that God is one, and that his Son is Yeshua the Messiah. They are trained to a nicety in Hebrew, for among them the entire law, the prophets, and the writings are read in Hebrew, as they surely are by the Jews. They are different from the Jews and different from the Christians, only in the following. They disagree with the Jews because they have come to faith in Messiah. But since they are still fettered by the law, circumcision, the Sabbath, and the rest, they are not in accord with Christians. They are nothing but Jews. A badge I wear proudly, by the way. They are nothing but Jews. They have the good news according to Matthew in its entirety in Hebrew, for it is clear that they still preserve this in the Hebrew alphabet as it was originally written. That's Epiphanius, Panarion 29. Panarion is also known as against all heresies. So the Nazarenes, the original Jewish followers of Yeshua, were listed as the 29th heresy that he was exposing in his book. Okay. The church father Jerome, who was the translator of the Latin Vulgate, well known for that, he described the Nazarenes as, quote, those who accept the Messiah in such a way that they do not cease to observe the old law. That's in his commentary on Isaiah 8:14. Okay, so here we have a nice description of who the Nazarenes were. And so that's point one. But I want to move on to the next important document I found. The next important document is the real smoking gun. It's a letter. It's like we hacked into an email account we weren't supposed to be able to get into. Okay? It's a letter from Jerome to Augustine. These were both 4th century church fathers, very well known. Jerome was the translator, as I said, of the Latin Vulgate. He created the Latin version of the Bible. That's the standard Latin version of the Bible used in Roman Catholicism to this very day. And Augustine, you've probably heard of also, was the bishop of an area of Africa we now call Algeria. But he wrote many major famous Catholic books like The City of God and so on. So these two important church fathers are emailing back and forth, except there's no email yet, so they're doing it the old-fashioned way with letters. And Jerome is responding to a letter from Augustine. So this is Jerome, letter 75. Okay? Jerome says, "The matter in debate, therefore, or should rather your opinion I should rather say, your opinion regarding it is summed up in this, that since the preaching of the gospel of Christ, the believing Jews do well in observing the precepts of the law, i.e., in offering sacrifices, as Paul did, in circumcising their children, as Paul did in the case of Timothy, and keeping the Jewish Sabbath, as all the Jews have been accustomed to do. If this be true, we fall into the heresy of those who, though believing in Christ, were anathematized by the fathers for this one error, that they mixed up the ceremonies of the law with the gospel of Christ, and professed their faith in that which was anew, without leaving and letting go that which was old. In our own day, there exists a sect among the Jews throughout the synagogues of the East, which is called the sect of the Manians. Now I want to give you a little information about this word Manians. It's Latinized. Clearly the Hebrew term intended is Manim. The Manim were is a Hebrew term that today means apostates, but probably came from an acronym meaning believers in Yeshua the Nazarene. The Nazarenes. As Jerome continues, he says, that is even now condemned by the Pharisees. The adherents to this sect are known commonly as Nazarenes. They believe in Christ, the Son of God, born of the Virgin Mary, and they say that he who suffered under Pontius Pilate and rose again is the one in whom we believe. But while they desire to be both Jews and Christians, they are neither the one nor the other. That's interesting, because Epiphanius said that they were complete Jews and they didn't call themselves Christians. I therefore beseech you, who think that you are called upon to heal my slight wound, which is no more, so to speak, than a prick or a scratch from a needle, to devote your skill in the healing art to this grievous wound, which has been opened by a spear driven home with the impetus of a javelin. For there is surely no proportion between the culpability of him who exhibits the various opinions held by the fathers in a commentary on Scripture, and the guilt of him who reintroduces within the church a most pestilential heresy. Notice he says reintroduces. If, however, there is for us no alternative but to receive the Jews into the church, along with the usage described by their law, if in short it shall be declared lawful for them to continue in the churches of Christ, that they have been accustomed to practice in the synagogues of Satan, I will tell you my opinion of the matter. They will not become Christians, but they will make us Jews. So Jerome was paranoid about these Nazarenes. He didn't want them to be allowed to even come into he was afraid that they would actually come into the church, which they didn't and haven't. He was afraid they would come into the church, and if they did, that they would actually convert the church over to their way of thinking. Now, why was Jerome worried about such a thing? He was worried about such a thing because, as Augustine had acknowledged in his repeating back to him, this teaching of the Nazarenes, that the law was still for today, it began with, it says, since, if we go back to the beginning of his letter, or the beginning of the quote from the letter, since the preaching of the gospel of Christ. I'm using his terminology, of course. So, he's saying this quote-unquote heresy began with the preaching of Messiah. Began with the gospel of Messiah, and then continued with Paul. As Paul, offering sacrifices, as Paul did, in circumcising their children, as Paul, circumcising their children, as Paul did in the case of Timothy, and keeping the Jewish Sabbath as the Jews have been accustomed to do. But then he says, if this be true, we fall into the heresy of those who, believing in Messiah, or Christ, sorry is what he says, were anathematized. In other words, it was declared a heresy. So what Jerome is telling us here is that the original followers of Messiah were Nazarenes. The original followers of Messiah were Torah observant. And the church fathers came along after the fact and corrected this misguided concept and declared it to be a heresy. The smoking gun, it's right here. He's admitting it. It's just, I mean, when I first saw this, I couldn't believe that I had the smoking gun. I had the church fathers admitting that our faith, the Nazarene faith, was the original, the one taught by Messiah and kept by Paul, and that the church fathers had since come along and declared that to be a heresy. But that was their thinking. You've got to understand. The church fathers and the early Catholics in those days, the beginnings of Christianity, they believed that it was a movement that was evolving out of misguided Judaism. And that this misguided movement, that it evolved as the church fathers finally realized that Judaism was in error and founded Christianity. So let's go back and see where this actually happened. Let's go back again to the church fathers, because Jerome tells us that the church fathers declared this teaching to be a heresy. And by the way, Jerome also says, remember, Jerome also expresses his concern that this error, that this apostate teaching might be reintroduced. Now, how can you reintroduce something that was never there in the first place? Jerome makes it very clear. He believes This was the teaching that the misguided Jews that were the original followers of Yeshua the Messiah held to. And that the fathers, the so-called church fathers, later declared that to be a heresy, and we should never go back to that heresy. And that if Jews are allowed to bring that, he's concerned that Jews might be allowed to bring that Nazarene heresy back into the church, and if they did, that they might actually transform the church into Nazarenes. Now, I don't believe that that will happen or should happen, but it's interesting that Jerome felt so vulnerable, that his position was so weak that it could not withstand debate. His position was so weak that if a few Nazarenes ever entered into the Christian church, they would probably end up turning it upside down and turning it towards Nazarene Judaism. Okay, so let's go back to Ignatius. Ignatius is probably the earliest so-called church father. In fact, when you get into, some of you may have run into Ignatius, because if you get into Sabbath debates, Sunday keepers can't prove their position in the Bible. They can't. They'll try, but they realize that they can't. So then they'll go to Ignatius, and they'll say, well, see, the very first Christians, and they go to Ignatius, and they'll show Ignatius taught Sunday keeping. So let's talk about Ignatius. Now, Ignatius was the bishop of Antioch. Now, you remember in Acts chapter, the end of Acts chapter 14, the beginning of Acts chapter 15, there was a conflict that took place at Antioch. Paul was teaching there, and this conflict arose over whether Gentiles had to be circumcised to be saved or not. Do Gentiles have to be circumcised to be saved? By the way, no. Do Jews have to be circumcised to be saved? No. By the way, that's what Rabbinic Judaism teaches today, so that's a no-brainer. Okay? You don't circumcise your way to salvation. All right. That doesn't mean you shouldn't get circumcised. It just means you don't circumcise your way to salvation. Okay. So the matter that came up at Antioch, where do they resolve it? In Antioch? They say, hey, let's go see the bishop. The bishop, he can straighten this out for us. He's the ultimate authority. No. They went to the council in Jerusalem to have the dispute settled. But Paul wrote, well, no, you go there. Let's stick with the script. Something changed. What changed? Because obviously today, if there arises a dispute in the Christian church, do they say, well, let's go to the Jews in Jerusalem and get the solution? You know, there's an old joke that the Pope's phone rings and he picks it up and he says, hello? And this voice says, hey, this is Jesus, using his terminology. I just wanted to call to let you know that I decided finally to establish my kingdom and to establish world truth. And the Pope says, that's amazing, that's really good news. He goes, yeah, but the bad news is, I'm calling you from Jerusalem. So, something changed. What changed is Ignatius. Ignatius, when he rose to power in 98 CE, very late 1st century, he usurped power. He seceded from the Council of Jerusalem. He rebelled from and rejected the very idea that he needed to answer to those people. Okay? Instead, he made a power grab. And he wrote letters to other Gentile congregations all over the world. And in his letters, he put forth the case that the local bishop of the local congregation was the ultimate authority, period, not answerable to Jerusalem. That ultimately led to a crisis later because you had all these Gentile Christian bishops all over the world that weren't answerable to anybody but themselves. And there became a jockeying for position for what they called a bishop of bishops. And you know who ultimately won that? The Bishop of Rome, which is where you end up with the Pope. All right, so Ignatius writes in his letter to the Ephesians. This is not Paul's letter to the Ephesians. This is Ignatius' letter to the Ephesians. He says, being subject to your bishop, run together according to the will of God. Jesus is sent by the will of the Father, as the bishops are by the will of Jesus Christ. Your bishop, I think you happy, who are so joined to him, as the church is to Jesus Christ, and Jesus Christ is to the Father. Let us take heed, therefore, that we not set ourselves against the bishop, that we may be subject to God. We ought to look upon the bishop even as we would upon the Lord himself. In his letter to the Magnesians 1:7, obey your bishop. And in 2:5 and 7, your bishop residing in the place of God. Be you united to your bishop. He that does anything without the bishop, Trillians 2:5, he that does anything without the bishop is not pure in his conscience. In his letter to the Philippians 2:14, he says, do nothing without the bishop. And in his letter to the Smyrnians 3:1, he says, see that you all follow your bishop as Jesus Christ the Father. So you don't have to go to Jerusalem anymore. You don't need the Jerusalem Council there in Acts 15. You come to me. I stand as the bishop, he's saying, I stand in the place of God himself. Wow. So, he takes the power grab, and he secedes from the Council of Jerusalem. But he does more. He creates a new and different religion. He says, be not deceived, this is in his letter to the Magnesians 3:1, be not deceived with strange doctrines, nor with old fables which are unprofitable. For if we still continue to live according to the Jewish law, we do confess ourselves not to have received grace. And then in Philippians 2:6, this is not Paul's letter to the Philippians, but Ignatius' letter to the Philippians. But if anyone shall preach the Jewish law unto you, hearken not unto him. So Ignatius is the one that actually makes an official doctrine for Gentile Christianity, that the Torah has been done away with. And then Ignatius was also the one who, many of you have heard that it was Constantine, but that was way later. Okay? And that was an official governmental act. No, it was Ignatius who instituted Sunday Sabbath keeping before the end of the first century. He says, let us learn to live according to, Magnesians 3:3. No longer observing Sabbaths, but keeping the Lord's day, in which our life is sprung up by him and through his death. Magnesians 3:3. So he said, don't keep the Sabbath anymore. We're going to keep the Lord's day. Now here, get this, Magnesians chapter 3, 8 and 11. Let us learn to live according to the rules of Christianity. Now, this is the first appearance in world literature of the word Christianity. It does not appear in the New Testament. Ignatius coined the word. Let us learn to live according to the rules of Christianity. For whosoever is called by any other name besides this, he is not of God. It is absurd to name Jesus Christ and to Judaize. For the Christian religion did not embrace the Jewish, but the Jewish the Christian. So he seceded from Jerusalem. He changed the day of worship to Sunday. He taught that the Torah was no longer to be kept. And he now had a new and different religion that he wanted to make sure everyone was clear was distinct from Judaism, which he named Christianity. And this is exactly what Jerome tells us the truth. If I'm just sort of a checksum, if you know anything about computers, not only do we see Ignatius doing it, but we also have Jerome recording that this is exactly what happened. That a new and different religion was created out of and away from, separated, seceded from Judaism. People talk about Hebraic roots and getting back to the Jewish roots of Christianity. I've got news for you. It hasn't done any. The origin of Christianity was the rejection of Judaism. You can't get to the Jewish roots of something that doesn't have any Jewish roots. There's two things the New Testament church didn't have. Does anybody know what they were?
Yep. The New Testament and church.
Exactly. The New Testament church didn't have a New Testament, they didn't have a church. Okay. This actually reminds me of something that happened many years ago. I don't know if any of y'all have heard of a famous Baptist preacher named Chris Well. Actually, he was, I think, pastor of a Baptist church in Dallas. And you may have heard of former chief rabbi. I'm having a blockage here. Does anybody remember the chief rabbi I'm thinking of here? Maybe you know the story. It's Shlomo Ben Goren, I believe. Anyway, Chris Well says, what are you going to do when the Messiah comes and it's Jesus?
Oh, yeah.
And the rabbi says, I really wouldn't have a problem with that. What are you going to do when Jesus returns and he's an Orthodox Jew?
There you go.
We're living in an amazing time right now. 30 years ago, when I was blowing the dust off of books in the library and looking up this information, I went to people. In fact, I went to the Messianic congregation that I was attending at the time. I went to the Messianic leader, and I tried to share with him what I'd found, this ancient sect of Judaism that embraced and accepted Yeshua as the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah of Judaism, and it wasn't Christianity at all. And he thought I was crazy. He thought I was crazy. I remember years later, there was an Orthodox rabbi from Israel named Moyal that I had studied under, that had come to the conclusion that Yeshua was the Messiah by studying the Talmud, the Midrash, and the Zohar. And Rabbi Moyal was at the congregation, and he had come to visit, and the Messianic leader told all of us we should stay away from him, because he was a new believer, and he would lead us astray. So I immediately connected myself with him. I immediately began studying with him as often as I could. I mean, he fortunately lived not far from me at the time. He was staying here in the United States for a while, and I took every opportunity I could to come visit him in his home and study Talmud, Midrash, Zohar under him. It was an amazing experience. But and I was going somewhere with that ties in with this, I'm not sure what. But the point is that if we really want to get back to the first century church, we've got to realize that the first century church was not Christianity, it was Judaism. There's a lot in so-called Messianic Judaism, there's a lot of anti-Judaism out there. Frankly, I was quite uncomfortable in those days. I was eventually drummed out of Messianic Judaism and pleased to, there was no place to go back then. I guess that's why I was going, the refreshing, we have places like this now. There was no place to go back then. It was just, I was studying with Rabbi Moyal in his apartment, and people saying, stay away from him. That was about it. So much has happened. There's a wonderful restoration that has taken place. And great things. Jewish people are coming to a knowledge of Messiah. And it's not because of Jews for Jesus. They may reach, secular Jews with Jesus, Reformed Jews with Jesus, but Orthodox Jews are coming to a knowledge of Yeshua as the Messiah. I know, I can tell you there are Orthodox rabbis. I know of an Orthodox rabbi in Jerusalem that is well known, that believes Yeshua is the Messiah right now, but is not prepared to come out with that information because he feels that if he did, it would wrongly appear to endorse the pagan customs and practices and antinomian habits of Christianity instead. All right. We're going to have a covered dish dinner. Hope you'll stay with us for lunch, after which we're going to have a Beit Midrash. And hope you'll stay with us for that, because we're going to take a Jewish view of the book of Romans and take you through Romans in a way that I'm sure you've never seen it before. Well, actually, it's part one, so it's a good time to get started, by the way. It's part one. And part two will be whenever I'm here again. I don't know when that'll be, but that'll be part two. So I hope you'll stay with us for that. Shavua Tov.